In this video, we are going to take a broad look at the different time periods of the English and British monarchy. And we are going to start out in the beginning with the Saxon kings and make our way up to the present house, the House of Windsor. So let's briefly discuss the Romans. The Romans took control of Britain in 43 AD. Centuries later, as the empire began to fall apart, the Roman army in 410 left Britain, never to return. This left the native population without a professional army. They were very susceptible to an attack, and this is exactly what happened. Around 450, two Germanic tribes, the Saxons and Angles, invaded. What developed out of this were 7 main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and you can see those realms on this map marked in red. So at this point, England was not unified. These kingdoms fought numerous wars in addition to having to fight off foreign invasions from the Vikings and Danes. Now, a few kings came close to conquering England. Offa, the king of Mercia, was able to conquer several kingdoms in the south, but this dominance did not last. In 829, Egbert of Wessex conquered Mercia, but he soon lost control of it. So historians generally list Alfred the Great as the first monarch on any list of the kings and queens of England. It should be noted that he was not the first king to rule all of England, but his reign represents the start of the first unbroken line of kings who would eventually rule all of England. Alfred faced many dangers during his reign. One of the main threats to England during this time period were the Vikings, and it was Alfred who developed the first comprehensive strategy to deal with these invaders. First, he would simply pay off the Vikings, and at other times he resorted to force. So again, as I mentioned, Alfred never actually took the title of King of England. That would not be achieved until his grandson, Aethelstan. The Saxon kings ruled for several centuries, but by the mid-11th century, a crisis developed. At the end of 1065, King Edward the Confessor fell into a coma without clearly naming a successor. This led to an ambiguity, which is a very dangerous word, in the all-important line of succession. Nonetheless, after Edward's death, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England in early 1066. Duke William II of Normandy, however, asserted that Harold had promised to support his claim to the throne. Adding to Godwinson's problems was the appearance of yet another rival. Harold Hardrada of Norway also claimed the English crown and launched an attack against northern England. Godwinson was able to defeat Hardrada's army, but just 1 week later the king himself was defeated by the Normans at the Battle of Hastings. And so the reign of the Anglo-Saxon kings came to an abrupt and bitter end. But what did this mean for the people of England? Well, probably if you were a commoner in those days, it didn't mean a lot. You just paid your taxes and gave your allegiance to a new lord. But to the English monarchy, it had an enormous impact. After the victory, William was forced to fend off several rebellions, all of which he defeated. And by 1075, William's hold on England was mostly secure. This allowed him to spend more time constructing castles and settling the Norman nobility in England. The House of Normandy reigned for less than a century before being replaced by the House of Plantagenet. Henry II became the first monarch of the House of Plantagenet. During the early years of his reign, Henry spent most of his time establishing control over Wales. In France, he gained full control over Anjou and the other areas. However, later on, Henry's successors lost most of the house's continental possessions in Europe. As a result, the later Plantagenet kings became more English in nature. It was also during this period the Plantagenet kings were often forced to negotiate compromises, the most famous being the Magna Carta. These deals put a check on royal power in return for financial and military support. The period also saw the establishment of English as the primary language. The Plantagenet reign was marked by a bitter rivalry between the two main factions, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. This culminated in the War of the Roses, which was really a fight for the English line of succession. The last Plantagenet ruler was Richard III. Richard faced major rebellions during his reign. The last rebellion involved Henry Tudor. Tudor was descended from the House of Lancaster, while Richard III, as I mentioned, was associated with the House of York. In August 1485, Henry Tudor and his forces defeated Richard's army. Richard died in the conflict, making him the last English king to die in battle. Richard's death marked the end of the Plantagenet kings, as well as the end of the English Middle Ages. Henry Tudor, after taking the throne, became known as Henry VII. He married Elizabeth of York, which effectively ended the War of the Roses, and gave rise to the Tudor dynasty. The Tudor monarchs worked very hard to centralize English royal power, which allowed them to avoid many of the rivalries that had plagued the last Plantagenet kings. This resulting stability allowed for the English Renaissance and the beginning of early modern Britain. The Tudors would rule from 1485 until 1603. They also extended their power beyond England, achieving the full union of England and Wales in 1542. They also asserted English dominance over the Kingdom of Ireland. Religious problems were a constant theme during the Tudors' reign. Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, but the Pope refused. As a result, Henry VIII separated from Rome and declared himself the head of the Church of England. When his daughter Mary became Queen of England, she aggressively attempted to reverse the English Reformation, which had begun during her father's reign. The executions that followed were a result of Mary's pursuit of the restoration of Catholicism in England. This also led to her denunciation as Bloody Mary by her opponents. Had Mary lived a little longer, she might have succeeded in restoring Catholicism to a much greater extent in England. But Mary died in 1558 and was succeeded by her half-sister, Elizabeth. In terms of religion, Elizabeth turned out to be relatively tolerant in comparison to Mary. It was also during her reign that England won a great naval victory, the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Elizabeth reigned for 44 years. Her long period of rule brought stability and prosperity to England. It has often been referred to as the Golden Age of England. Elizabeth died in 1603 without naming a successor. Her cousin, King James VI of Scotland, ascended to the English throne as James I. This also led to a new house, the House of Stuart. In addition, this led to a union of the Scottish and English crowns. Although the crowns were merged into one, the kingdoms of Scotland and England remained sovereign states, with their own parliaments and judicial systems. During his reign, James experienced great difficulties in England, including conflicts with Parliament and an assassination attempt called the Gunpowder Plot. It would become even more unstable when his son Charles I was crowned king in 1625. Charles often quarreled with the Parliament of England. In turn, the Parliament attempted to restrict the king's power. The main area of contention was Charles' firm belief in the divine right of kings, an idea which had been promoted by his father. This political doctrine asserted that the king's authority was absolute, and that a monarch could not be held accountable by anyone on earth, including Parliament. And so Charles issued his own decrees, which, not surprisingly, became very unpopular. He even raised taxes without parliamentary approval. Eventually, a civil war broke out in 1642. Charles and his royalists fought the English and Scottish parliaments. Charles was defeated and compelled to surrender in 1645. Despite being taken prisoner, Charles still refused to accept his captors' demands for a constitutional monarchy. Charles escaped imprisonment in 1647, and with that the Royalists rose again in May of 1648, igniting another civil war. The Royalists were defeated by parliamentary forces led by Oliver Cromwell. Charles was convicted and executed for high treason in January of 1649. The monarchy was then actually abolished, and a republic called the Commonwealth of England was formed. Cromwell served as Lord Protector of the Commonwealth from 1653 until his death in 1658. After his death, various factions competed for control of the Commonwealth. This instability led to the restoration of the monarchy. Charles' son, Charles II, would take the throne in 1660. Similar to his father, Charles II clashed with Parliament, and so he decided to dissolve the institution in 1681. Charles II also converted to Catholicism on his deathbed. Charles' son James then became king. James, like his father before him, was Catholic. There was a great amount of anxiety when his wife, Queen Mary, gave birth to a Roman Catholic son. There was now the real possibility of a permanent Catholic dynasty, which caused widespread alarm in Britain. As a result, in June 1688, a group of Protestant nobles invited the Prince of Orange to come to England with an army. Despite having a superior army, James refused to fight and fled to France. However, James was captured. Soon he was set free and allowed to go into exile. The overthrow of James became known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688. This led to the passage of the English Bill of Rights. The bill gave specific constitutional rights to individuals. It also gave Parliament more power over the monarchy. After King James was removed, his daughter Mary was declared queen. She would rule jointly with her husband William, who had helped to overthrow her father. William and Mary were both Protestants, which was much more acceptable to Parliament. Parliament also passed legislation that prohibited a Roman Catholic from ascending to the English throne. In addition, an English monarch could not marry a Roman Catholic. The last ruling monarch of the House of Stuart was Queen Anne. You will remember that back in 1602, King James had unified the English and Scottish crowns into the British crown, but the respective parliaments remained separate. During Anne's reign, the kingdoms of England and Scotland were finally united into a single sovereign state known as Great Britain. This occurred in 1707. Anne continued to reign as Queen of Great Britain until her death in 1714. After Anne's death, George I became king. George was Anne's closest living Protestant relative. George's succession established a new house, the House of Hanover. It was during George's reign that the powers of the monarchy diminished even further. The king had little control over domestic policy, as Britain began to transition into the modern system of a cabinet government led by a prime minister. Toward the end of George's reign, real political power was held by Robert Walpole. Walpole is recognized as Britain's first de facto prime minister. After George I died, his son George II was crowned king in 1727. The end of his reign was notable for Great Britain's involvement in the 7 Years' War. Britain allied with Prussia against France, Austria, and Russia. The 5 great powers of Europe were all at war. George III became king in 1760. Several notable events occurred during George III's reign. The first was the union of the parliaments of Great Britain and the Kingdom of Ireland. This new entity became known as the United Kingdom. The second major event was the United Kingdom's participation in the Napoleonic Wars. The last British monarch of the House of Hanover was Queen Victoria. By this time, the United Kingdom was already an established constitutional monarchy, in which the reigning monarch held little political power. However, behind the scenes, Queen Victoria attempted to influence government policy and appointments. Victoria's reign of 63 years and 7 months was longer than any of her predecessors. Her tenure has become known as the Victorian Era. During her reign, the United Kingdom experienced profound changes in terms of culture and industry. Her reign also saw a doubling in the size of the British Empire. After her death, Queen Victoria's oldest son Edward ascended to the throne. Edward VII inaugurated a new royal house, the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. This was done because Edward's father descended from one of the royal lines in the modern region of Bavaria, Germany. As king, Edward helped modernize the British Navy. He also contributed to the reorganization of the British Army. Edward's reign saw profound changes in society, especially with the rise of socialism. Edward VII died in 1910. His son George V ascended to the throne. During World War I, George changed the name of the house to the House of Windsor. The reason for this was the significant amount of anti-German sentiment during the course of the war. Elizabeth II is the current reigning monarch of the House of Windsor. In 2015, Queen Elizabeth surpassed her great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, to become the longest reigning monarch in British history. In the next video, we are going to take a closer look at Alfred the Great.